Our next speaker is Louis Vallaint. Louis has worked in Australia and New Zealand as a decorative arts curator and has been the director of the Johnston collection in East Melbourne since late 2008. Prior to his current appointment, Louis was curator of applied arts at the Auckland War Memorial Museum for 14 years. As director of the Johnston collection, he has led a small team that has developed a new and exciting program of public lectures and community activities that focus on all aspects of fine and decorative arts. With the inclusion of literature and music, this program is integrating the elegant Georgian townhouse and its collection into the community in a stylish and innovative manner. Louis is an Attingham Trust alumnus and attended the 2004 Attingham Summer School in England. So without further ado, developing a new audience for houses and collections. Louis.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for introducing me, and thank you too to Richard and members of the Copland Foundation for inviting me to participate in the Future Approaches conference today. And it's lovely to see Annabelle too, who I haven't seen for a couple of years, since she was last in Melbourne. And of course it's a great program, and I'm looking forward to seeing what other people do and the new perspectives and approaches that they bring. I'm going to talk a bit about developing audiences for the new audiences for collections, and of course I'm focusing really on what the Johnston collection's done over the last 25 years, and in that way I sort of want to think about it, and in terms of thinking about what other people have been talking about, is still thinking about it as a very new organisation that's still finding out what it's doing, and still I guess by not having a long sort of institutional history or even a sort of history associated with itself, that it can sort of adapt to change, and part of that is sort of taking risks as we continuing to take risks as we go along. And I'll just really talk about, what was it? F5? No? What do I press? What do I press? Space. I know, I mumble. I know. Oh, okay, I'll try and... Is that better? Ah, good. Thank you, Andrew. No, I'll use this one. Is that better, Andrew? Yep. So I'm just going to really talk about the development of the House Fair Hall as a sort of quasi sort of heritage or museum site or house museum, and then an introduction of our historical or our styles of presentation and interpretation, which has really gone alongside the progressive development of our audiences, and to some new methods of interpretation, collaboration and intervention that's used in Fair Hall. And then just to do some scary stuff at the end, which is what that means in terms of our actual visitations and what we're up to next. And so I'll just begin with a sort of broad historical framework, and explaining on some of the experiences that we have developed in our museum environment with references to other current museum practices over the last couple of decades. And this is, I'll start with William Johnston. Shortly before his death, who's the benefactor of our collection, William Johnston, who was an antique dealer and collector, contemplated the idea of establishing a museum of fine and decorative arts comprising his residences, Fair Hall and Shanpara, to showcase his collection of Georgian Regency and Louis XV antiques. Johnston was specific in what he wanted. He wanted a museum arranged in domestic settings as compared to gallery-type displays or even historical house museum displays that he had seen in England. His will was drawn up that allowed for the establishment of a private trust and independent museum. Johnston had been gathering items by the late 1920s when he was working at Ackman's, a department store in Collingwood, Melbourne, and he used these items to decorate and rearrange his family homes, especially his mother's home in Brighton. He sold his first collection before he left for London in 1957, and it can be assumed that when he was in London, his taste for the Georgian style was reinforced. Around 1972, his Greenwich collection was transferred to Fair Hall when Johnston relocated for health reasons to spend equal time between Melbourne and London. He'd also amassed a separate collection at Shanpara, his country property, and outsourced pieces to his rental properties that he had around East Melbourne. So before his death, Johnston hoped that the collection he had of around 3,000 pieces be retained. He died in 1986, and in his will he described his collection of antiques and artworks, including furniture, paintings, miniatures, prints, ceramic, silver and objects of other metals, glass figures, embroidery, chandeliers, light fittings and carpets. What he did do was that he also made provision to maintain the collection with an endowment, which is fundamental to us, that the contents should be rearranged regularly, which is equally as important, or in fact more important to us because it gives us freedom, and the collection can be added to. And those three principles really define us in the way that we can work with our audiences. And this is Fair Hall. The trustees, and this is Johnston's Fair Hall. The trustees were given the job of what to do with all of his properties and all of his stuff within 6 months of his death. When Johnston died, he left Fair Hall and Shanpara, as well as his retail outlet, Kent Antiques, that he had in Armadale High Street. The trustees quickly established the museum in 1986 and then had to work out what to do with it all. They also knew that in the previous 50 years or so, numerous museums had been built and many house museums had opened. Locally, of course, there were existing historic houses set in time, such as Ripponlea or Como, and perhaps Carrick Hill in Adelaide. The trustees could, however, due to the wishes of the benefactor, consider other ways of working, especially as they had the endowment. They knew that the contents could be regularly rearranged and the collection could be added to. They did know, what they did know was that it was a house and that it had always undergone change. Fair Hall had been built in 1860 for John Cumming and was originally a single-fronted house, and it was extended sideways in the 1870s to double its frontage. And when Johnston came along and purchased it in 1952, he altered the front of the Victorian house to create a more Georgian appearance and, in a sense, made the front more symmetrical and put more bars in the windows to make it frames to make it look more Georgian in style. And he also repurposed the interior rooms into 3 flats, which he subsequently rented. He came back in 1972 to live in it and undertook further renovations to Fair Hall. This is the green drawing room that we can see, and this was his major reception room. He took out the back wall and put in the conservatory windows that we can see at the back, those archtop French doors. He put in columns and laid black and white tiles and sort of put lots of whitened out or slightly modernised the interior of the house. So this is what the trust was left with. How he lived, this is him in his sitting room in his flat. This is one of the upstairs rooms, which we now call the Yellow Room, which is rented out to Angus Winnicky. This is country property in Shanpara, which the trustees eventually sold, but it gives an idea of his sort of modern, I suppose, London look treatment. His bedroom in Shanpara. The kitchen in Shanpara, which was quite basic and simple. So the trustees had the idea of creating Fair Hall. And you can see the sort of building on the left is Fair Hall and the building on the right is our administration building. So between 1986 and 1989, the use, purpose and function of Fair Hall was discussed by the trustees, and external advisors were consulted to assist with this process. Judith Thompson was appointed as the inaugural director and she led the project. 80 Cox and Partners prepared the application for our planning permit. A conservation study for the establishment of the museum was prepared by Peter Lovell of Alum Lovell and Associates, and Lovell went on to supervise the restoration and the refurbishment of both these buildings. And David McCabe, who is a design consultant, came in and laid out some of the concepts for the house. And when he first viewed the house, he found it curiously impersonal. There were no photographs, no books, no memorabilia, and there was no proper bedroom. After submitting various design approaches, it was agreed by all that the approach was simply to enhance any obvious stylistic themes that were already there. And at the time, the objective in the presentation of the house was to maintain the atmosphere created by Mr. Johnston and to build on this atmosphere. John Rogan, who was a trustee, expanded on what those stylistic themes might be, and he said, "We are anxious to ensure that Bill's style and connoisseurship will be reflected, and that involves a fulsome approach to furnishing, an almost cluttered style reflecting comfort and pleasure in lots of objects." And John Patrick, the landscape architect, came in and he designed the garden schemes, which have since been altered. But the garden plan was to actually create a flower garden in the English manner, highlighting Johnston's love of gardens. So those are the four key people that recreated Johnston's house into the first iteration of the house that we have today. And of course Johnston, the idea that we do have is that Johnston constantly moved his pieces around, and that we should continue to do this, and it should happen in the museum, and that gave the idea that visitors would be able to come back time and time again and see things anew. It's what he did in his shop. He created vignettes, and we carried on that idea. And some of the options, and they went through a series of different things about choosing what they could do, because if you remember those earlier images, Johnston's way of living was particularly cluttered, perhaps, or overstacked, rather than being pleasantly arranged. And just a sort of visual idea of where they got some of their ideas from. Johnston, as an antique dealer, of course, wanted to show people how to live with fine possessions. He was a decorator and an antique dealer, and so a lot of his ideas about what's in the collection and how it's displayed comes very much from his approach as an antique dealer and making things perhaps more blingy or appearing to me more than what they are, and that idea that he loved pairs and classical balance. And of course that upper left image of the green drawing room as it once was, and of course it's very indicative of that sort of style, 50s, 60s style of white walls, box pleated curtains, and the sort of velour boxed sofas and chairs. And Judith Thompson, who was the inaugural director, and so the results of her efforts turned out to recreate Fair Hall into this first iteration, and this is how it looked after it opened, and it's a complete, in a sense, completely different approach to what Johnston did in terms of that in terms of advancing that symmetrical relationship and sort of good, clean, classical, well-styled display of the house. The blue room, which was Johnston's bedroom, turned into an area looking at early oak and European furniture. The white room, which was his sitting room, and the yellow room upstairs, which was completely made over from the flat, but it did retain the black and white tiles that Johnston liked to use on the floor. And the kitchen, which was really taken out and opened up as open storage in a way. Oops, there's the yellow room again. And then there came a new direction because that look by Judith Thompson was said to feel quite stiff, and they wanted a more homely feel with the house. And with Anthony Knight, who's also an Attingham alumni, coming in, his approach and his ambitions that he had for the house was that it should reinterpret the concept of the London look, or an early version of the English country house style recognised by the work of English decorators such as John Fowler, John Cornforth and Sybil Colfax. And the idea to sort of bring in that idea of the celebrity designer or design look that had been used in English National Trust properties after World War II. And I guess you could say that this was could be seen as indicative of that new approach that Anthony brought in with the Yellow Room in Avery Row of John Fowler, the sort of key sort of style that came in terms of creating that sort of cluttered, shabby, nice sort of decorative treatment. And so also with this treatment of Fair Hall changed, and a sort of new myth was added to that sort of Johnston look of creating this sort of London house interior. And so the house changed around again, and you can sort of see the treatment that's also happened, taking away from Johnston's earlier look with those more historical or historically informed window treatments, but that sort of lush, more fulsome approach with Anthony's decoration and that sort of tablescaping and the introduction of flowers, and creating a sort of another sort of touchstone of Johnston's perhaps Britishness, which it wasn't, or even Melbourne's Britishness, and a reinventing or a reconstructing or developing another level on Johnston, perhaps, but not really based on Johnston himself, and to show a sort of new way of things changing and bringing new approaches. And it's sort of interesting in a sense in the fact when you sort of think of the earlier, the way that Johnston lived and the way of turning it into a museum with respect to the trustees in terms of the way that they had sort of approached the house is, in a sense, what else could they do to make the house more sort of agreeable or interesting, or interesting for the sort of audiences coming through, and what they could see, because in a sense Johnston's look perhaps wasn't the sort of style that the trustees or perhaps visitor interest demanded. And so that sort of full-on tablescaping and object upon object. And one thing that visitors did want to see was that even though the kitchen had been stripped out to make a sort of open storage area, visitors wanted to see a kitchen, so a kitchen was put back in, just as much as upstairs the bathroom was stripped out, taken away from the 1960s, 70s pink enamel bathroom, and a bathroom sort of was put back in, so that an idea or impression of what those earlier bathrooms or kitchens might be. And it's reasonable to say that during this time the house actually stayed the same. It didn't actually move. The idea of rearranging it regularly didn't happen. The ideas or the shows that came into the house were things that related seasonally. There was an orchid show every year, and that was a great attractor. And some small things were done around Christmas. And it was said during this period, and it's noted in the trustee minutes, that it was recognised that with a house in this way, that most people who wanted to see the house would have seen it. And it was quite clearly stated, and I still find this horrific, and I can still quote it, that all the people in Melbourne will have seen the house, and in 10 years' time nobody will want to see it, and we will have lost our audience. And there's the bathroom as it changed. Then a new person came in, Nina Stanton, who we've sort of acknowledged earlier today. And she, of course, also looked for some future change and future directions and some expansions. It's very important that she does have her clipboard here. She came in, and what had happened just before she arrived is that there had been a newly formed friends group, which is another story about what we do, but there'd also been established a group of volunteer guides. So parallel with this, Nina had to do something with them because they were there and they had come and they were very enthusiastic and involved with what we did, and so she put them to the task of actually researching the collection and finding out what the pieces in the collection was, because there had been sort of little interest in that apart from the fact that the objects were there themselves. And what she did was she, sort of a week after she got there, was she first drafted the first business plan for the collection about what it was going to do over that next period of time. And at the same time as the guides were researching the collection, Nina actually researched the history of Johnston, and it goes along something like this, that this is William Johnston's parents, Mary Louise or Louise Friedrichs and Robert Alexander Johnston. Mary Louise or Louisa had worked in Stanford House in Clarendon Street, just around the corner from Fairhall. She was introduced to her future husband through the housekeeper. She was a scullery maid. The idea was that she saw in this house the finer things in life, and so began her aspirations. She married a bootmaker and moved out to Lilydale. This is Johnston's father's bootmaking shop, as in the expanded version. You can just sort of see it behind the coach there. And this is where Johnston was born in 1911. This is him as a child. He's not a very smiley person. This is, we hope, and it's one of the very interesting things. He's not a very smiley person. He's quite a cantankerous person. In fact, some people will call him other words, which is why we always begin our presentations with a photo of Johnston smiling, because it sort of creates another myth about that person as well. But a myth that was created about Johnston was that his grandma Friedrichs gave him this cup at the age, somewhere between the age of 7 and 13, it's said. Our story goes that he was given it by the age of 8, and that was the cup that started the collection. He actually purchased a Staffordshire zebra slightly before that, and that's said to actually be his favourite piece. But in terms of our story making or our narrative, it's the cup that started the collection. He goes to school in Lilydale. The figure on the right-hand side is his cousin, and this is a dress that he made for her at the age of 8. He was encouraged to work with the tailors or the seamstresses next to the bootmaking shop, and so we begin another part of his story where he actually has manual dexterity skills. He can sew and he can also knit. He's not particularly academic. He's sent off to Assumption College in Kilmore. That's him on the left. He's actually a very good swimmer, but his father wants him to be a tennis player, but he's very good at arranging things. And from that, he leaves school at the age of 14 to work in Buckley and Nuns as a window dresser, then moves to Ackman's Monster Furnishing Shop, where he begins buying and selling antiques. His mother makes her move away from Lilydale to a house in Camberwell, and then through that, and when her husband comes back to live with her, she asks him to pay rent for living with her, and then from that she can move to a house in Brighton. Johnston goes to Greenwich. He purchases Fairhall, and as I've said, redoes the facade of Fairhall. He opens up Kent Antiques, and then begins his next aspirational jump in terms of becoming that gentleman collector or that connoisseur, buying a country property in Tilden. And, oh gosh. So the next thing we go to is Christmas, which is started out in 1990. Gee, I'm going to go way over time. Which started out with Anthony Knight creating the Christmas decorations and making them for a number of years, and then Nina came in and asked different groups to come in and create those decorations. And so from about 2006 we've been inviting people from outside of Melbourne to create Christmas decorations that are inspired by the collection and inspired by that story. So the leap forward here is that we are creating stories based on the collection, but also with more relevance to the story of Johnston himself. And so what that has done over time is actually build up a series of people and contributors who have a relationship or have established a relationship, and we have an ongoing relationship with them, and they have become our sort of core audience. And one thing that happens with the Christmas exhibition is that softer, more gentler way, I suppose, of approaching the collection is that there is a spillover into, from people seeing the house, that they actually want to see the collection itself. And so the tipping point is that they come in and want to see the collection ordinarily. So there's a lot of our inspired buys. But then, of course, outside practices mean other ways in other museums, like Bowes, which was built up. The English sort of an English example is that they sort of went out of fashion and had to look at new approaches. So what they did in the mid-90s was invited artists in to re-look at their collections and other ways of getting audiences to look at the collections and see them in different ways. So they have Cecile Johnston putting in those 5 pictures there, contemporary works being replaced into historical houses and giving them a new context. The Gursky work, contemporary landscape compared to the historical. And also people like the British Museum who are looking at those older displays and getting new people in to re-look or create new ways into the collection. And so what Nina did was begin to bring in other people to rearrange the house rather than it being staff. So like the British Museum brought in external people, Nina started bringing in other people to interpret the collection and have new ways of seeing. The first one was Sean Girton, a theatre designer, so that relates to Johnston's flatmate Angus Winnicky, who worked in theatre, bringing in personalities like Lynn Landy, who was the governor's wife, Lady Potter, Richard Thompson, so people with an interior background, or like Johnston himself, and other antiques dealers, so creating completely different looks. And then the third example of what we're doing is those other sort of interventions or bringing artists' approaches into the collection. And Claire Twomey was invited into the V&A to re-look at or reconsider the ceramic galleries that were up on the 7th floor that were dismantled. She sort of got to re-look at them and got people to reconsider those ceramic collections before they died. But also Balsay Hall, which is a great case study of houses that don't have collections, and invite people in to do different projects to get them to look at spaces or places without collections. Geraldine Pilgrim's work is really sort of quite nice because it looks at that idea of a young lady who would live in the house but be conditioned by the house, and knowing that her life expectancy is to sort of sit and have numerous cups of tea. Victor and Rolf doing a mannequin in the Great Hall, and Ron Merck, who we know from exhibitions in Australia, looking at scale. But also the idea that while they're successful examples, there are examples of this sort of approach that don't work. Takashi Murakami followed on from Jeff Koons in Versailles, and these installations or interventions by artists in the Palace of Versailles actually backfired on the trustees of Versailles, because petitions were raised, 15,000 people wrote complaints about the fact that these were Disneyfying these spaces and they lacked the sort of interest in them. We moved on to getting personalities in like Akira Isagawa to curate the house and create stories. His was really quite biographical about Johnston, with different themed rooms. And then more recently, Pascal Gomez-McNabb came in and curated the house and looked at it in relation to food and the excess of the collection and excess of eating with installation works. And then quite recently, Romance was born. And then what I'll quite quickly do is that we've moved on through the gallery and gallery programs, because we're adding to our programs that what we do. But what I just thought I'd like to show you with this graph is that really to acknowledge the work that Nina did with the house, because that sort of period between 2001 2005 where she was doing all that fundamental work of, and we've heard it with the previous talk, of looking at all those fundamental things, working out plans, getting things going, putting things in place, that really after all that was done we were able to increase our programs and then increase our audiences. So from 2007, while we were doing these programs, the background to this was also that the trustees were investing in what we were doing so we could increase our audiences and developing our audiences. So in 2007 we got additional administration staff and curatorial staff. 2008 the trustees changed, and that really changed the way we could do things, open up our different approaches, and then our sort of, I suppose it follows on what I'm saying on it, is that our audiences developed from that with sort of risk taking that we were doing within our programming. And there are sort of other things in terms of what's happening in 2012 with when we've been doing Romance Was Born and Pascal Gomez McNabb, which are our more risky programs, and so we've had some pullback from those. And then quite quickly, what the Copland Foundation has done, which is what I was really meant to be talking about, is that we're now going on to our next stage, which is developing the building, making a purpose-built gallery space, upstairs lecture space, and making this space better purposed and more useful to our future audiences, as we know that we're delivering the programs for them that they desire. Thank you very much. Sorry for going on.
Thanks for the tour through the Johnston collection, past, present, and sorry we abbreviated the future on you a little bit, Louis. Afternoon tea now, a short break, and then we're back for our final two speakers after that.